Hi all, so welcome to this channel, and in this video session I'll discuss DB2ROW versus DB2 SQL trigger mode. So here let me brief you few points, few differences here. That is DB2 for I support two trigger modes. One is DB2ROW and another one is DB2 SQL, and the default mode is DB2 SQL. Now, what is the difference and how we can differentiate them basically? So, this depends upon the triggering event and how we are writing our trigger. Or so, one thing here is if we are using for each row and before, that is, the trigger is for each row and before, then there is no sense to compare ModeDB2ROW and ModeDB2SQL, because if we are making a trigger for creating a trigger for each row and that's a before trigger, that's always a DB2ROW or default a DB2ROW. So we cannot um, say that we should use DB2SQL there. We should use ModeDB2ROW. That's a ModeDB2ROW. Now, in case if we are using for each statements, then there is no sense to say to use ModeDB2ROW. In that case, we are always using ModeDB2SQL. And after, since for each row means it's applicable for each changed row, so it is triggered after each row gets changed. But for each statement means after execution of every statement it gets changed. So in case of uh, statement execution, there could be chances that multiple row inserted, deleted, or updated. So we if that's for each statement trigger, then the mode should be DB2SQL and the trigger should be after. And if it's for each row and before, then it's always mode DB2ROW. So there is no sense of comparing these two. If the trigger is written in these two way, means the trigger is for each row and before and for each statement. So the main difference comes when we use for each row and after. So there only we can have that ModeDB2SQL and ModeDB2ROW concept. Now we can either use ModeDB2SQL and ModeDB2ROW. So what's the difference then? So let's say um, we have two rows in the table, and we either we are inserting, deleting, or updating. So let's pick one case where we are updating. So if I am updating both two rows, so let's say if I am updating both the rows, so what happens if I would have used for each row and after, means the trigger gets activated after updation of the records in the table for each row. So for every row that trigger is activated for every changed row. So if there are two rows which gets changed, so the trigger would be updated two times. But the difference comes when they will be activated. So if the row mode is DB2ROW, so after each row change, the trigger gets fired. Okay, so the row change, trigger fired, row change, trigger fired. This way the mode DB2ROW works. But in case of mode DB2 SQL, row changed, row changed, row changed, row changed, that is all the row gets changed with that SQL statement, and then after that trigger gets fired. So if update happens on the table and it updates both the rows, so both updated at once, and then the trigger gets fired n number of times. N number of times means the n number of time, n is where is the number of row gets updated or changed. So if two rows updated two times, that trigger gets fired for each changed row. So this is the difference between these two. So let me show you the demo. I have created one example here. So this in this trigger we are using DB2ROW concept. So the name of the trigger is this, creating this trigger. This is the program name, so the object gets created with this name. Now This is an after trigger and for each row. So the mode could be DB2ROW or DB2SQL, referencing new row as new and old row as old, just because this is an update trigger, so we have access to the old and new row. This is the body of the trigger where I am begin and end, declaring two variables, default 0. If old dot number is not equals to new dot number, then summing them. So for every row gets changed, the default would be 0, so we are basically summing the same number, the number which we are updating. So there is no sense of accumulating here. This is just to show you that how it works. So let me compile this, run SQL stm SQL trigger. So this gets created successfully. Let me check if now this one, let's see for this one. Let me drop this if it is already existed. Okay, it's dropped. So here you can see this was the trigger named mode DB2 SQL demo. The same name, program name would be trigger 14 for each row mode DB2 SQL, and everything else is same as you can see. But here what we are doing is we are summing the numbers and for new and old values. So basically all the rows gets updated at once, and then the trigger get fired the number of times the rows changed. So it would get filed if say two rows changed, so it would get filed for two rows, but the result would be same. So let's see, let's compile this as well. So both are compiled successfully and the object gets created. Let's debug. Let's trigger first debug the mode DB2ROW. Set the breakpoint at line number 1. So we can see the number is 2 for every row. So let's update this to 1. Now you can see that the first row gets updated and the trigger gets fired, since it's an after trigger for each row and mode is DB2ROW. So this is 0 0, and here we are checking old number is 2, new number is 1, old sum is 2 and new sum is 1, and this is the end. Again you can see the trigger gets fired, it's on first line. So let's check again, the second row gets updated, the trigger gets fired. DB2 mode is DB2ROW here. It's 2, it's 1, again it's fired. So let's check again. So it's 1, 2 and 1, again it's fired. So now all the rows are updated and trigger gets fired after every row gets updated. So you can see 4 rows updated successfully. and the trigger gets fired on every row update. So basically in DB2 row mode, what happens if the trigger is after and for each row, then for every change row the trigger gets fired after the row gets changed. Now in DB2 SQL, let's see what happens. Okay, we are now debugging this program. Now set the breakpoints. Since this is on file 10, let's see if this has data. This won't have any data, so let's insert some records. So let's say 1 and 2. So this table has two records, 1 and 2. Let's update this. TRGPF10. Let's update 1 and 2 to 5. Now since the mode is DB2 SQL, as we can see here, so you can see 1 and 2 are updated to 5 each, because this is mode DB2 SQL. So after each row gets updated, the trigger gets fired the number of times the row gets updated. So now you will see that this trigger would be fired 2 times because 2 rows updated successfully. So this is old dot number. Okay, so we are getting old number as 1. So basically it is summing 2 times, so it is making 2, and new dot number is 5, so making it 10. Again this gets fired, so this is the second time. Now it is getting 2, so it is summing 2 times, and it's 10. So as I can say here is we are using the concept of table. So and from that table we are basically fetching old dot number. So there is no way of fetching this thing. This is just for the demo purpose. So you can directly use these fields are available, but I just use them. If you want, you don't need to use these things. This is not just needed here. You can directly use numbers, so you will be getting the actual numbers which are there from, but in that case you'll be getting the same result here. So I just want to show you the different results, so that's why I showed you here. So the main purpose of this trigger program was to show you how this works. Basically DB2ROW works, how DB2SQL works. So in case of DB2ROW, the trigger gets fired on every row gets changed, either inserted, updated or deleted, after every row gets changed. And in this case DB2SQL, once all the rows gets updated, inserted, deleted, after that your trigger gets fired. So the logic would be depend upon you, what logic you want to write. It's only up to you, and the way these two works are explained here in this example, where DB2SQL tells you that this would be updated n number of times, where n is the number of row gets changed after each row gets changed. and in DB2ROW that would be activated after each row gets updated. So that's all in this video, where you learned about the difference between these two and how they actually work. So that's all. Thank you and have a nice time.